Today, we're going to have a look at the Flashforge Voxelab Aquila. Can you tell which one of these is the Aquila? Yeah, I can't either. And I think that's a problem. But first, let's start out with the Aquila itself. It's a 220 by 220 by 250mm build size. It's got a 32-bit board, silent drivers, a 0.4mm nozzle, a color LCD screen, aluminum oxide coated glass bed, no auto leveling, no filament sensor, the standard Creality style Hotend, good print quality actually, but plenty of design flaws, and a price between $150 and $200 depending on when and where you buy it. It's pretty much the same recipe we've seen repeated over and over again over the last years with minimal variations, and just like all the other Ender-3 clones, this one is fine if you turn a blind eye to a couple of things. Though, honestly, I was expecting a little bit more after I saw the hype from you guys for this very machine back when I was working on the Elegoo Neptune 2. Let's start out with the good stuff. Like I mentioned, the print quality is actually really good, on par with what the other machines in its class can do, and if everything works well, it's easily competitive with the big boys as well. Print quality out of the box is something that you should really be able to take for granted these days. Speaking of out of the box, the unboxing and assembly is fine too. The manual is well done, the assembly itself isn't overly complicated, and in general, you shouldn't have any problems getting this printer running. They even tell you to adjust the V wheels on the bed and carriage, but as all manufacturers do, then forget to instruct you to actually lock them, so as on other printers, these wheels will come loose over time. Easy fix though. The manual does basically end once you've got filament loaded and are printing the first included parts, as the included troubleshooting Q&A is questionably useful with tips like adjusting the transmission ratio if the accuracy isn't good. Like, I don't even know what they're trying to say here. They are including their own slicer, Voxel Print, a renamed version of Flashforge's, you guessed it, Flash Print, which is pretty basic and has a few quirks still, like by default generating supports that work for resin prints but not for filament printers, and estimating print times that are at least 30 to 50% too short, but it's totally usable and produces good results. But as always, I wish they would just use and possibly contribute to the excellent open source slicers, Cura or Prusa Slicer. Both of those are open for any manufacturer to submit their printer profiles and be included in the official releases, or even like Elegoo and Creality are doing for manufacturers, just to create branded versions. I doubt that Flashforge Voxelab have the ambitions to develop Voxel Print to a level where it could rival either of the open source solutions, so I think just using those would be a better choice. On the printer, really the only thing that stands out is the comfortably sized LCD screen. It's not a touchscreen, and instead it uses a physical click wheel, which I much prefer, especially since the interface is responsive and straightforward to use. You can still tell it's a bit of a tossed-together mashup of nicely anti-aliased JPEGs and hard-generated text, but it does the job. What I do miss are graphical print previews on the screen. It has the space to show them, but even though they've got their own slicer, which should easily be able to include those with the print files, for some reason, that's a feature that's missing. But what's actually missing more than anything else is any sort of innovation or improvement over the dozens of other Ender-3 clones. Like, at this point in the review, I've already talked about everything that's unique to the Flashforge Voxelab Aquila that I can say. It's an Ender-3 clone with a big screen. That does not feel like enough of a reason for this machine to exist, alongside all the other versions. Angus just did a fantastic video on a range of topics about the, let's call it weird stuff 3D printer manufacturers are doing, and one of his points was that really manufacturers are just throwing as many machines onto the market as they can just to take up space on storefronts, get more coverage by reviewers and possibly waste their time, and by that to drown out everyone else who tries to sell a 3D printer too. This is one of those machines that is done with the absolute minimum amount of engineering effort that's required to produce a new product. Like, just look at all the flaws that they perpetuate with this very machine. Let's start with the core 3D printer functionality, the Hotend and the Extruder. The Hotend is a standard Creality style Teflon lined one where the Bowden tube runs through the Hotend until it touches the nozzle. That's a design that is notorious for failing over time as the Teflon degrades, deforms, and constrains the filament path, and notorious for the Bowden coupling slipping, so eventually the Hotend will produce jams and hiccups that are pretty hard to identify unless you know exactly where you're looking. The extruder. Same 49-cent plastic construction with a single brass drive gear pushing the filament in. It works for now, but as the brass wears down, it's only going to get duller. And there are plenty of reports of these plastic extruder bodies starting to crack. Then the everlasting issues with cable management. On the Aquila, the major cable bundle rides straight over the IEC power connector and essentially blocks off the on-off switch. But also, the wiring coming out of the bed, it has so much reinforcement in it that I guess they thought was useful as strain relief, but they simply ended up moving the spot where that bed wiring kinks instead of preventing it in the first place. And eventually that is going to fail, just further away from the bed. Moving on with electrical, while the main board does look fairly clean, in the unboxing livestream I casually pulled off one of the heatsinks from the knockoff dynamic drivers and found a massive aluminum flake just wedged in there comfortably. I don't think I need to tell you why having a sharp conductive aluminum chip pressed up against the board and its components is not a particularly good thing. There's still obvious design flaws, like the screw heads that hold down the glass bed. They stick out beyond the top of the aluminum surface. You can hear that. That causes an air gap between the aluminum and the glass sheet. I did a whole video on how that creates huge issues for thermal transfer from the heater to the glass, and makes especially the outside edges of the bed barely usable because they'll be colder than the rest and more sensitive to being cooled down by the part cooling fan blowing over the bed. In the case of the Aquila, if we look at how much the bed manages to heat up past the 20-degree ambient temperature, the center, where the clips press down, actually gets 50% hotter than the rest of the bed, which makes printing large parts kind of hard. And it's not something you can solve by just adding more clips, because the bolts are still sticking up and creating an air gap. Oh, and these clips? Well, they overlap with the electrical traces on the underside of the bed, and the chances are high that over time, they will rub through the insulating solder resist and short out some traces, which not only makes the bed heat less evenly, but also increases the current the bed draws, and that, combined with the bed wiring wearing down over time, could be a bit of a fire hazard. The mainboard and connectors stay reasonably cool, so that's good to see, but they are tinning the wire ends of the heaters instead of using a proper crimp, a proper ferrule. So over time, that tin will flow out under the pressure from the screw clamps, which increases the resistance in that connector, and that can eventually melt the connector and start a fire. Why? But the most atrocious thing about safety on this printer is the thermal runaway protection that they actually managed to make worse than if they had done nothing at all. So thermal safety on a printer consists of a couple of things, and it all focuses around making sure that the heater elements won't overheat. So the first one, and the Aquila is doing that perfectly, is checking that when it sends power to a heater, be it the bed or the heater cartridge in the hot end, that it actually starts seeing a temperature rise in the thermistor that's measuring that temperature. So that protects against the thermistor, for example, falling off the bed. It's just taped on in this case. So on the Aquila, huge alarm, full screen message, perfect. But the other two potential failure modes are the thermistors experiencing a wire break, anywhere between the mainboard and the thermistor, or an internal short. And both of those cases are easily detectable, and normally if you don't have any checks at all, only the case of an open circuit would have the printer keeping on heating. A short, on the other hand, looks like it's reading a super high temperature, so in that case the control loop would say, oh, I'm at temperature, I don't need to keep heating. So that would be fine. However, in both of those cases, the Aquila just goes and completely freezes up. The screen becomes unresponsive, there's no alarm or anything, and it just keeps on heating. So I wanted to see what would happen to the machine in that case. And thankfully, in my case with this very machine, it didn't burn down or melt anything. There was a good amount of smoke from the silicone sock, and because there's so much Teflon in and around the heater block, that would have released a good amount of neurotoxins. I reran the test with a thermocouple hooked up, and it got to over 330 degrees Celsius within 10 minutes. That's with the thermocouple just wedged between the silicone sock and the block, so it probably got quite a bit hotter on the inside. And that's not a room you want to walk into without some serious breathing protection. The fact that the printer just freezes has me thinking that they tried to implement some sort of a safety feature, but ended up screwing that up so badly, and now that code just crashes the entire thing. Like, sure, that can happen. No software is perfect, but Flashforge either didn't care to test these safety features or intentionally decided to ship the printer anyway, knowing that this stuff wouldn't work. And both of those options are like, wow, that's just unacceptable. And no, it's already fixed in a firmware update, that is not an excuse. This is how they shipped the printer. This is what they thought was acceptable. Most people never update their firmware. There's no reminder on there or anything. This is how, I don't know how many thousands of people will be using this printer. This thing just shouldn't exist. Now, I could at least somehow see a reason for this printer to exist if it had some actual features that were maybe new. I mean, if you go through what Voxelab tout as new features, there's print resuming after a power outage. I tried that, but when it resumed, the printer managed to knock over part of the print, lose some steps, and basically ruin the part. Then they're saying there's, quote, filament auto feeding. Put in the filament end and it starts feeding automatically, which is a lie? This printer has no filament sensor, so loading filament automatically is something the machine is physically incapable of doing. They've got a menu for the filament sensor, but it's not actually on the machine anywhere. I can see 2 threads, but that's it. And then it's claiming not just silent printing, but ultra silent printing. And to be fair, separate drivers are doing a great job of keeping the motion quiet, but the hot and cooling fan, the part cooling fan, the mainboard cooling fan, and the one in the power supply, they all add up to a soundstage that is anything but silent, which is why I've got it turned off the entire time. It's pretty annoying, actually. Oh, and a big feature apparently is having belt tensioners. Like, true, it has belt tensioners, but that's hardly a new feature. One of the other things I saw them point out is there is support for adding a BL Touch. And yeah, they did add a dedicated socket to the mainboard with the pins for a BL Touch, and there are 2 extra tabbed holes on the toolhead, but that honestly sounds more like they intended to ship with some sort of a sensor, then cut that feature to save cost, kind of like the filament sensor. But they decided they could market the traces of where that sensor have been as a feature. They're not exactly documenting how to enable a BL Touch, so the community has had to come in and provide custom Marlin 2.0 builds for the Flashforge Aquila just to enable that. So, what is this printer? I mean, they call it a DIY machine, but are they implying that it's then up to the user to make this work as a proper 3D printer? Because as Flashforge Voxelab sell it, it sure looks like it's going to last just long enough for people to write their hype Amazon reviews or make a review video about it. And then after a couple of spools of filament, all the spots where, you know, they cut corners or simply screwed up the design decisions will start to show. So, like, at that point, you're supposed to DIY fix and upgrade it? Which is, I mean, it's fine, honestly, if you need a hobby. Lots of people, including myself, spend a lot of time tinkering with 3D printers, but then you're not left with an actual tool that you can use for other stuff. The 3D printer itself becomes the stuff you work on. 4 or 5 years ago, when the Ender-3 was still fresh and it was a huge upgrade over the other standard budget 3D printer, the Anet A8, this would have been right up there. But in those 4 years, nothing substantial has really improved about these machines. And with this one in particular, even the stuff that already has been figured out by someone else is not on here. The Hotend and Extruder combo is absolutely bottom shelf. There's no filament sensor, there's no magnetic flex bed. Wire management is still bad. The fans and the way they run them is poorly done. Thermal protection is worse than it's ever been. And overall, there are just too many design flaws and mistakes to be excusable. Now, it looks like that must somehow have become accepted, because if you check out the reviews on the Voxelab site, all you see is 5 stars throughout. And sure, it's not like the Aquila is so much worse than all the other Ender-3 clones. But you know, while things like smartphones are moving into the direction of being able to choose one by going over which one does the fewest things wrong, 3D printers seem to be moving more and more towards it being easier to list the very few things they do right. That's not a great spot to be in. That's not something that's particularly unique to the Aquila. I mean, all the other Ender-3s are fine, basically, until they break. But the more manufacturers keep pushing these unoriginal and unimproved machines onto the market, the less of a reason there is for them to exist. So, originally, I wanted to write this entire video in a bit of a different style, where I would only talk about different fast food cheeseburgers and the difference or lack of differences between them. Because honestly, it doesn't matter if you get a cheeseburger from McDonald's, from Burger King, Wendy's, Jack in the Box if you're in the US. They're all the same soggy, uninspiring, basic food item that, yeah, provides you with some low quality calories, but does anybody really look forward to another borderline disgusting basic cheeseburger when they've been eating the exact same thing for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? I don't. What about a long chicken? A Royale with cheese, a Le Big Mac, seasonal specials, vegan options, or maybe trying an actual properly made burger for once. Instead, with 3D printers, cheeseburgers is all it is. And they're fine, but not much more. But you know where you can learn to make some seriously tasty burgers? This week's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community that, of course, has classes on how to make the perfect burger. But whether you're just curious or want to develop a new career skill, Skillshare has just the class for you. Whether work from home has you burnt out and you need to recharge a bit with Jonathan Van Ness's Ultimate Self-Care Playbook, or you're interested in video production and would like to learn from the best out there with MKBHD's class, YouTube Success, Script, Shoot, and Edit, they've got you covered. Like, not to brag, but I realized my workflow is already remarkably similar to what Keith is doing, but as you may have imagined, they've just got it nailed down to a T. I learned a lot about how to more efficiently script and produce videos, which also benefits all of you watching. Most of Skillshare's classes are fully produced, but they've now also got live classes where you can really interact with teachers and fellow students. Whether the classes are live or pre-recorded, there's always a way to ask questions or learn from classmates in the discussion board under every class. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and if you want to try them out, the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so that you can start to explore your creativity today. So, thanks for watching. Choose your burgers wisely. As always, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and get subscribed. Let me know what your favorite burger place is in the comments below, and maybe even buy me a burger through Patreon or through YouTube memberships. But otherwise, keep on making, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.